Our third presenter is Alexia, who will speak about gender and research assessment.
So hello, everyone. What a fascinating morning we've been having. Thank you to all our previous colleagues. So I'm Alexia Panayiotou. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Cyprus in the Department of Business and Public Administration, and I'm also the UNESCO co-chair on gender equality. We're presenting part of the work that we're doing for TWIN4MERIT. We're doing this work together with Dr. Kyriaki Koura, and we're splitting the presentation in the two parts that you see here. We titled this Gender and Research Assessment, Proposing a Move from Responsible to Responsive Research Assessment. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about gender and research, which is our initial title here. I think it addresses many of the points that were already discussed by the two previous presenters in our panels. I think our presentation is more or less a summary of what has already been noted. And then Kyriaki will propose to all of you something that we've been discussing and thinking a lot about. Let's call it a move from a responsible research assessment, which was the first part of our discussion today, to our proposition of responsive. So we really look forward to your input on this so we can move our work forward in the year and a half that we have left on TWIN4MERIT. So I'm going to, I know we talk a lot about excellence and greatness, and I'm actually starting off here with our own school's strategic plan. This is the previous strategic plan. And what you see here is our aim to be great. We have excellence noted here. It's something that we discuss about. And then when you go through our previous strategic plan, what do you see? It's not important, the details here, but just have a look. Okay, we have obviously a lot of graphs, and we have these arrows that go up and down, and we're very proud of our improvements in our rankings, in our publications in 4-star journals, and of course, we aim to increase all of this. At the same time, you see here the number of female faculty in our school. It hasn't changed substantially from what was presented in our previous strategic plan. Now, our main question, the one that has been guiding our research, is whether or not these constructs, this greatness and this excellence, are actually gendered constructs. Or, if I can say it another way, is what happens when we rely on metrics from journal lists and rankings to impact factors and citation indices to define excellence when their gendered construction, as our two previous speakers have noted, remains gendered and relatively unexplored and problematically hidden. Now, just so we situate ourselves, theoretically, we come from the perspective in organization studies that universities are gendered organizations in which gender and sexuality are often obscured through a gender-neutral asexual discourse. And as Matthias, I believe, noted earlier, we too use gender as this situated category of analysis that is instrumental in understanding differences, not just in bodies, but also in our organizational discourses and practices, especially at the level of the university. Now, what do we mean by this gendered construction of excellence? Well, different things, actually, and Erin already pointed to an example, and Matthias did as well. I'll just give you a very brief visual stimuli here. So from the Times Higher Education, we see that women take about 15 years more than men to become professors. This is from the LSE blog that you see here. We know that there are issues in regards to funding. Again, this was noted by the previous speakers. Obviously, there's disparities in promotion, but also in hiring, in citations. Erin spoke about the Matilda and the Matthew effect. So again and again and again, we have so much evidence that shows that basically in every step of the evaluation process, there are gender effects. Starting from applying for an academic job. We've already had a discussion on this, but again, for the sake of cohesion here, what happens when we apply for an academic job? Well, we see, and I won't give you the exhaustive works here, but for example, we see that reference letters are gendered. We know from research that letters often written for women rely a lot more on personality characteristics than they do on work. We see that the nouns that are used for men and women are different, and we see that the evaluation of the adjectives used is also different. So what, in other words, if a woman is spending a lot of time on her work or is seen as workaholic, well, that's a different effect than a male who is seen as workaholic. In applying, it depends on our evaluation committees. Oftentimes, evaluation committees are are all male committees. This is very often the case for the University of Cyprus. We have data on this. Over 60% of our evaluation committees are only male, made up of male colleagues. And in our school, this is very much the effect as well in the Faculty of Economics and Science. We spoke about graduation from prestigious universities that would fit in applying for an academic job, and all the discussion that goes around to who goes to which universities, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to hiring, well, it seems that even though we like to see our processes as being meritocratic and objective, our data shows that it's not necessarily like that. For example, if women are co-authoring a paper, oftentimes it is assumed by panels that the woman had less of a contribution in this co-authored paper, even if it's seen as if the names are presented in an egalitarian way, than a male colleague in this co-authored paper. Now, when it comes to going from lecturer to assistant, again, we see very different effects there. A woman oftentimes needs more publications to make this move than a male colleague. In regards to going from an assistant to a tenure position to an associate, again, as you saw previously in the research that I had noted, it takes much longer for women to make this step. Citations, age indices, journal rankings, topics that have been chosen, et cetera, all of which we have already discussed, will fall into this step. And again, the step from tenure to professorship has gendered effects in many different ways. For example, in how citations are used, but also the extent to which admin work or teaching evaluations are evaluated for men and women. So teaching, which is typically devalued, is seen as more important for women. So it's a double-edged sword, in other words. And admin work which is also devalued in evaluations, seems that it burdens women a lot more. So we have these double-edged swords. I'll skip through this slide, so I'll give more time to Kyriaki to talk about our proposal. But time and again, in many, many different ways, we see this gendered construction of excellence. If we see excellence as being perceptual, what we think of as excellent work, then we're saying we need to come and acknowledge these implicit or oftentimes unconscious biases that make up for that. Just as a side note, it's not just academia, of course. I'm giving here an example. This appeared in The Guardian a couple of years ago. It's a study that shows that when we look at paintings, different paintings, when they're signed by men and the same painting signed by a woman, it's being evaluated not just differently, but up to 10 times more when it's signed by a male artist than a female artist. Of course, none of this is so much of a surprise. When we think of art history books, for example, the classic book I understand that is being used in art schools, in its 800 pages, it features one woman artist. Okay, so none of this is perhaps so surprising. Obviously, there are other biases. Who gets cited where? We spoke about this. We know that the top journals don't just feature specific subjects like Matthias noted, but also people from specific schools and specific countries. That was the presentation by Lizzie and Eva this morning as well. In other words, we're far from meritocracy. Our Dutch colleagues here call this the sheep with 5 legs. I understand that this is from Dutch. I don't speak Dutch myself. In other words, it seems that we're going after something that is unattainable. This is how I understand the Dutch expression. So if the attempts currently made to address the problems raised by these traditional metrics, we understand that they're problematic. Let's see what responsible research assessment can do for us. Well, our perspective here is that maybe we need to go even further. Maybe this, it's not enough, and Kyriaki will speak to how we may still be encountering problems.
The responsible research assessment attempts currently made, we noted that they still leave gender behind. And to start with, there are, as mentioned previously in the previous presentations, there are some keywords by Dora, Hong Kong Principle, the Leiden Manifesto, Quara, and the Metric Tide report of 2015 and 2022 that do encourage responsible research assessment. We seek to problematize this from a gender lens, and we identify 3 key problems concerning gender in research. And first one is how responsible research assessment is defined. Then I will proceed with scope and then the content. For the first part, which is the definition, we see here 2 very different definitions of what we consider to be, what we interpret to be as responsible. And we must ask, which does either of these definitions consider gender? And if so, to which extent? Then moving on to the scope, we see that different initiatives have a varying scope. It varies significantly. For instance, the Leiden Manifesto has a very narrow focus. It focuses on guiding the responsible use of quantitative metrics in research evaluation, whilst DORA, on the other hand, is a broad initiative that seeks to change how researchers and their outputs are evaluated on a systemic level across institutions, publishers, and funding agencies. On top of their different scope, we see that neither truly integrates gender into assessment practices. Now, there's also a problem with the content of responsible initiatives, and we will provide 3 examples if time allows. The first one is DORA. So I will not provide much of a background here because it's been discussed a lot, but the issue is that the declaration's text does not address the problem of bias on the original text, and especially in its recent guidelines published in 2024, it only goes as far as stating that there is an encouragement to avoid biases as much as possible. Is this encouragement enough? Is it possible to mitigate gender bias without explicitly acknowledging the problem and proposing clear measures to address it at every step of the evaluation process? Our second example are the Hong Kong principles. So these principles, developed in 2019, had a clear goal: to strengthen research integrity in research assessment. Notably, they explicitly refrain from addressing gender. The reason, the justification given in the text is that gender is related to social justice and not research integrity, and we disagree with that. Firstly, the elimination of gender bias is relevant to research integrity because the exclusion of diverse perspectives could lead to biased, incomplete findings. Also, it could lead to asking the wrong research questions. And we saw in the previous conversation what consequences this could have in health research. Our second disagreement with that is that we find this approach to overlooking how individual assessment criteria can reinforce systemic gender bias. And without that, existing inequalities perpetuate. On our third example, which is the Leiden Manifesto, we see that it was published in 2015. It has 10 principles. And we see at the introduction of the manifesto that there is a strong criticism of the over-reliance on metrics because they can overshadow expert judgment. And there are some strong words there: impact factor and obsession. Evaluation is now led by data rather than by judgment. Now, the remainder of the text does not align with this skepticism that's expressed in the introduction. And what we see is that instead it continues to advocate for the responsible use of metrics. And interestingly, here responsibility is equated with accountability. And again, sadly, it fails to, the manifesto fails to even acknowledge problems of gender bias in both research metrics, but also peer evaluation. We're moving on to our proposal, which is in progress. Previous slide.
I think your proposal, we covered that. I'm just looking forward to hearing what it would mean for you to take gender into account.
Should I?
Yeah.
Drawing inspiration from MER, we propose a shift from responsible research assessment to responsive research assessment. And what does that mean? For our purposes, responsiveness means that it is essential to integrate a thorough understanding and mitigation of gender biases at every stage of the evaluation process. because without such measures, evaluation will remain fundamentally discriminatory. We discuss here there are two initiatives that we consider to be not perfect, but promising in that regard, because there are many elements of what we hope responsive research assessment to be. So the first one is the ongoing system reforms in the UK, which have been discussed previously. And for the first time, they have now committed for the upcoming ref exercise in 2029 to address gender bias. And this is an important development, because in the 2022 Harnessing the Metric Tide report, which influences ref exercises, there's a warning that an over-reliance on quantitative metrics can marginalize women and foster a toxic culture. The important point here is that this connection was less evident in the 2015 Metric Tide report, so the original one, which focused more on responsible metrics. However, it did not address their impact on gender and research culture. So we'll consider this to be a promising way forward. However, it remains to be seen how it will be implemented. It is encouraging to see that compared to the ref exercise in 2021, now the environment criteria will expand to people, culture, and environment with an increased percentage of 25%. And this is done at the expense of the previously known outputs criterion, which decreases by 10%. There's a typo there, it's 60% instead of 65, so it drops by 10. Then the other initiative that we consider to be very promising is an example that we found at the University of Maryland's Department of Psychology. There have been efforts there to implement reforms to tenure and promotion guidelines to embed gender equality and diversity within academic evaluation. And three important steps were taken to that direction. The first one is that they abandoned the use of metrics due to inherent biases that disadvantage women and underrepresented groups. This is coming from that, not me. The second one is that they shifted from an outcome-based to a behavior-based evaluations. And then they introduced awards to encourage diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including research on underrepresented groups. And we're also in the process of studying similar efforts by Utrecht University. In conclusion, these are some thoughts that we are thinking about. What we note is that by acknowledging that excellence is in gender constructs, essentially means that any attempts to measure it should explicitly address any preconceived, supposedly objective notions that end up disadvantaging women. This premise allows us firstly to critically examine the extent to which existing guidelines do perpetuate some assumptions and fail to acknowledge implicit gender biases. It allows us to analyze who defines those objective standards of excellence and reveal entrenched power structures. And finally, to assess whether these guidelines do have the potential to fundamentally transform research assessment practices. Overall, we argue that this means that all aspects of the evaluation process should be responsive to the needs of society, which means that the betterment of society and the elimination of gender bias should be the criteria that determine the quality of work. And this, we argue, should not be done necessarily to other metrics, but rather by critically evaluating against, taking a step back, and thinking of whether these traditional or responsible approaches should have been used to begin with, in which context, and to what extent. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks so much for very interesting input to this sort of ongoing discussion. When I wrote my thesis on gender inequality in academia some years ago, I trawled through all the old literature from the start of the discussion of NPM, New Public Management, and its role in universities and so on. And the interesting thing was back then, the early studies, there were feminists emphasizing that this might be an advantage because the prior system was based on idiosyncrasies. Peer review only, no metrics, and that disadvantaged women more so. Now they could at least point, although the metrics might be biased, now they could at least point to them, as Erin shows, the prominence of those would reduce the gender bias, right? So my point here is, how can we ensure that these types of things you introduce here do not involve idiosyncrasies and these more sort of personal peer review related aspects? How can we ensure that we don't return to that sort of system by introducing these new important aspects?
I think that's a very key question, but perhaps we need to go back to the open science principles to answer that. So I believe in openness and transparency, and we believe in plurality. So I think once you get these values in place, it's possibly the only way to address these implicit and hidden biases. Otherwise, I feel like it will be this sheep with 5 legs. It will always be elusive, and we will perceive as being meritocratic simply because we can count things. What do you think?
Well, at least I think it's a very important step to sort of move towards specific criteria. Then it's just like how they are assessed, which is right, like the challenge, like, but I think that's an important step. Yeah.
Yes.
It's just an observation. There's a common tendency to state that bibliometric indicators are gender biased. For example, if you use indicators to select, to promote a scientist to a higher rank in the academia, or if you use that indicator to assess performance, research performance, general thinking is that the indicators are gender biased. My perspective is that the use of indicators may be wrong, not the indicator itself. In other words, citations generally say they assess scholarly impact, and that's a fact. I mean, if 100 people cite a paper, that means that paper had an impact, scholarly impact, let's say, equal to 100. But then you may argue, but that paper would deserve more citations, and the fact that it was cited only 100 times is because it was authored by a female, right? But where is the origin of that bias? That maybe male scientists didn't cite it because it was authored by a female. But the indicator itself measures that impact, and that's a fact. But how do we face this problem? How do we try to eliminate that bias that you mentioned? For example, through bibliometric indicators, we can do it. Because if we disaggregate women performance from male performance, and then we say, and then we look at the distribution of performance of women, we normalize the performance by, let's say, the average of the distribution. We have a normalized performance of female and male. Then if we put together the normalized performances, you can have a female who had a performance twice as much as all the other females. That is in the overall ranking, when you put together the two disaggregated rankings, that female could be top one, even if she produced less. It's just like in sports, you know, you disaggregate the performance, women and men. So you solve all these problems. So it's, once again, it's not problem of the indicator, but the way you use it.
Well, it's yes and no, actually. It's yes and no, because when we're looking at these indicators, we need, for example, citations. We need to be asking who is cited by whom. We don't actually do that, right? So that could be a problem with the perception of the indicator as being meritocratic. Okay, so that's one point. My second point is not so much if the citations show impact, but the reverse. What does the lack of citations show? Our perception is that the lack of citations shows less impact. But these terms are problematic if the construct is itself problematic. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? In other words, just because a research isn't cited doesn't mean it's not good research, doesn't mean it doesn't have the potential to be impactful. It could very well be that who conducted this research, who reads this research, who gives the benefit of the doubt to this research is all implicitly and unconsciously biased. So at the end of the day, we're missing out on potentially very good and impactful research when we rely on these constructs. I think that's the point we're trying to make. Not that someone who gets citations doesn't deserve those citations. We're looking at the people who don't get the citations. Why don't they get citations?
If I may say something, what is missing is the context essentially, and this is what we encourage to do before the evaluation is conducted. So we're missing the context of the particular evaluation process. We're focusing on the outcome, but we're missing the context, I guess is the point.
It deserves more time to discuss this, maybe.
It does.
Yeah, let's continue the discussion during lunch. I apologize for doing lunch at quite a Cypriot time for most of you, but let's target to be back at about 2:45. Thank you.